It had been unveiled on what would have been Diana's 60th birthday, a deliberate act by her sons to place her likeness in a public garden that millions could visit. Bronze, life-sized, surrounded by the white roses and forget-me-nots she had favored, it occupied a shallow amphitheater of lawn and path that turned every visitor into a temporary pilgrim. People came with flowers, with children, with the particular silence that gathers around objects that have outlasted argument. For 5 years it had simply been there, an accepted feature of the landscape, neither weapon nor provocation, until the morning the gardeners found it gone, not moved for cleaning, not veiled for maintenance, destroyed. The first staff member to enter the garden at dawn stopped short at the empty plinth. The bronze was missing. In its place lay fragments of stone and soil, the surrounding beds trampled, a single white rose crushed into the mud beside the inscription that still bore Diana's name and the dates of her life. Within 20 minutes the garden was sealed. Within an hour a preliminary report had been written. By mid-morning the news had reached the Duke of Kent. He was 91, the oldest working member of the family, still charged with formal responsibility for aspects of its heritage and continuity. He had spent a lifetime in the quieter machinery of the institution, ceremonial duties, military associations, the unglamorous oversight of properties, collections, and commemorative objects that connected the present to the long past. Those who worked with him spoke of a dry precision, a dislike of unnecessary speech, and a memory that retained protocol the way other men retained grudges. When the report of the statue's destruction was placed in front of him at his desk, he read it once, then again, and said only, "I see." He did not raise his voice. He did not summon Camilla. He did not telephone the king in the first hour. He simply began a sequence of actions that would, within days, restore the bronze to its place and extract from the queen consort a price precise enough to be felt and restrained enough to leave her with almost nothing she could publicly protest. Camilla's decision had not been impulsive. Those closest to her later understood it as the product of a long, private accumulation of resentment that had sharpened after the coronation. The sunken garden statue had always been an irritant. It stood on land that formed part of the official London home of the Prince and Princess of Wales, yet it belonged, in the public mind, entirely to Diana. Visitors did not come primarily to admire the planting or the architecture of the garden. They came to stand in front of the bronze and remember the woman Camilla had, in the long narrative of the public, displaced. Every anniversary, every documentary, every quiet photograph of flowers left at the plinth renewed the comparison. Camilla had endured decades of that comparison. After the coronation, she had begun, carefully, to test how much of Diana's remaining physical presence could be diminished without triggering open conflict. Small adjustments to floral tributes, quiet suggestions about modernizing certain commemorative arrangements. The statue was the most visible and therefore the most dangerous of those tests. She chose her moment with calculation. William and Catherine were in the countryside with the children. Harry was an ocean away. The king was occupied with a short overseas visit that left the domestic machinery running on reduced senior oversight. The works order was framed as routine maintenance to the garden's irrigation and planting. Contractors were given instructions that left little room for hesitation and still less for questions. The removal took place after midnight. Floodlights were kept low. The bronze was cut from its mountings, lowered, and taken to a location where, under further instruction, it was broken. The head separated cleanly, an arm shattered, sections of the drapery cracked. By the time the first gardener arrived at dawn, only the empty plinth remained, still bearing the inscription that named the woman the bronze had once represented. The Duke of Kent received the first detailed account from a member of the Royal Collection staff, who possessed both the authority and the nerve to bypass the usual filters. The Duke listened without interruption. Then he asked 3 questions: whether the damage was reversible, whether the order could be traced to a specific instruction, and whether the garden remained closed to the public. The answers were partially yes and yes. He nodded once and began to work. His authority in matters of heritage was not absolute, but it was old, specific, and rarely challenged. He held long-standing roles that gave him formal standing in the oversight of certain royal properties, collections, and commemorative objects. More importantly, he possessed the kind of institutional memory that younger members of the family sometimes underestimated. He knew which committees could be convened at short notice, which conservators could be trusted with urgent and discreet work, which private secretaries still answered to the older forms of protocol, and which arguments would carry weight with the king even when the king's personal preference leaned toward domestic calm. Within hours, a conservation team had been assembled under the Duke's direct authority. The broken pieces of the statue were recovered from the location where they had been taken and transferred under secure conditions to a workshop that specialized in the restoration of outdoor bronzes. Assessment began immediately. At the same time, a formal minute was prepared documenting the unauthorized nature of the removal, the breach of established procedures for the alteration of commemorative works on royal property, and the requirement for immediate restoration at the expense of those who had authorized the original act. The language was dry, technical, and devastating in its implications. It did not accuse the Queen Consort by name in its opening paragraphs. It did not need to. The chain of instruction was clear enough to those who would read it. Camilla learned of the Duke's involvement by the middle of the afternoon. The report that reached her was careful, but the meaning was unmistakable. An elderly royal with no flair for publicity and no interest in modern media had taken ownership of the matter and was treating the destruction of the statue as an institutional violation rather than a private family disagreement. She attempted, through intermediaries, to frame the episode as a misunderstanding about garden works that had exceeded their brief. The intermediaries returned with the same message. The Duke of Kent was not interested in reframing. He was interested in restoration and in accountability. The king was informed that evening in a conversation that those familiar with its tone later described as brief and uncomfortable. Charles had spent years attempting to manage the competing legacies within his own family. He understood the symbolic power of the sunken garden statue better than most. He also understood that his wife had acted without the consultation such an act required, and that the Duke of Kent's intervention now gave him a narrow path. Support the restoration as a matter of heritage protocol, thereby avoiding a direct personal confrontation with Camilla, while still correcting the overreach. He took that path. A short written assent was issued. The Duke's authority to proceed was confirmed. By the following morning, the garden remained closed. The conservation work was underway, and a concise internal directive had been circulated to the relevant private secretaries and property managers. The statue would be restored to its original condition and returned to its plinth at the earliest possible date. All further alterations to commemorative works on the relevant properties would require formal approval through the established heritage channels. The directive carried the Duke's authority and the King's assent. No press statement was prepared. None was required. The restoration itself was executed with deliberate visibility inside the household and deliberate discretion outside it. Conservators worked in shifts. Missing sections were recast from existing molds, detailed photographs, and the original sculptor's records. The bronze was cleaned of the marks of cutting tools, repaired at every fracture, and reassembled with techniques designed to ensure the joins would remain invisible under ordinary viewing conditions. The surrounding beds were replanted with the same varieties that had framed the statue since its unveiling. Within a matter of days, the bronze stood again in the sunken garden, the inscription once more legible, the white roses returning to their places. When the garden reopened to the public, Visitors saw only that the statue was where it had always been. They were not told how close it had come to disappearing permanently. The price extracted from Camilla was quieter and more precise than any public rebuke could have been. She was required to formally acknowledge, in a written minute that would remain in the institutional record, that the removal had proceeded without the necessary authorizations and in breach of established procedures governing commemorative works. The acknowledgement was not released to the press. It did not need to be. Its existence was known to those whose opinion mattered inside the household. She was further required to meet the full costs of the emergency recovery, conservation, and restoration from her private funds. The sum was not ruinous for someone in her position, yet it carried the unmistakable character of a penalty rather than a voluntary contribution. Most wounding of all was the adjustment in her practical standing within the smaller circle that managed heritage and commemorative matters. Where she had previously been able to influence certain decisions through informal channels and personal authority, those channels now ran more carefully around her. Invitations to discussions that touched on the physical legacy of previous generations became less automatic. Recommendations she offered on related subjects were received with a new and noticeable formality. The Duke of Kent, without ever raising his voice or granting an interview, had demonstrated that there remained layers of the institution in which the Queen Consort's preferences were not decisive. Those who observed Camilla in the weeks that followed noted a new restraint in her manner when the subject of Kensington or of commemorative gardens arose. The confidence that had marked the early period after the coronation had been tempered. She continued to perform every public duty with professional composure. She did not speak of the statue. She did not contest the restoration. Yet the lesson had been delivered in a language she understood. There were still senior figures within the family whose authority predated her arrival and whose loyalty to the longer continuity of the institution outweighed any personal accommodation to her wishes. William received formal notification of the restoration on the same day the bronze was returned to its plinth. Those closest to him recognized his silence as relief edged with something colder. He had not been consulted about the original removal. The fact that the correction had come from the Duke of Kent rather than from him or from his brother spared him a direct and potentially explosive confrontation with his stepmother. Yet it also underscored how close the erasure had come to succeeding in the brief window when senior attention was elsewhere. When he next visited the garden, he stood for a longer moment than usual in front of the bronze. He said nothing that was recorded. The statue's renewed presence required no commentary from him. Catherine, walking the same paths with Charlotte and Louis a short time later, paused at the plinth while the children examined the flowers. She did not explain the statue's recent history. She simply allowed them to look, and when Charlotte asked, as children do, whether the lady in the bronze was the same lady in the photographs at home, Catherine answered with the careful truth she had always offered her daughter, that it was, and that the statue was there so that people would remember her. The children accepted the answer and moved on. Catherine remained a moment longer, her hand resting briefly on the edge of the plinth before following them. Harry learned of the episode through private channels that remained open despite the distance and the years of separation. His response, never made public, was said by those who heard it to have been brief and absolute. The statue his mother had been given on the anniversary of a birthday she never reached had been defended by a man in his 90s who still understood what certain objects meant. That fact carried its own weight across the ocean. The Duke of Kent returned to his ordinary schedule within days of the bronze's reinstallation. He made no statement. He granted no interviews. He accepted no credit. When, in the months that followed, the subject of the sunken garden arose in internal discussions about planting or visitor access, he listened more than he spoke. On one occasion, asked whether modest changes to the surrounding beds might be considered for practical reasons, he replied only that the existing arrangement had been restored to its proper condition and should remain so. The matter was closed. Inside the household, the episode entered the category of events that are remembered with precision and discussed with care. New members of staff were briefed on the tightened procedures for any work affecting commemorative objects without being given the full narrative of why those procedures had been so firmly reasserted. Older staff required no briefing. They had seen what happened when an attempt was made to remove a bronze that the public still treated as a point of pilgrimage, and they had seen who had stopped it. The lesson required no repetition. Camilla's overreach had been driven by a desire to diminish a presence that continued to compete with her own in the public imagination and in the physical landscape of the family's London home. The result was the opposite of what she had intended. The statue stood again, its restoration quietly understood by those who needed to understand it as a reassertion of limits that predated her and would outlast her. The Queen Consort retained her title, her schedule, and the public dignity of her office. What she lost was the assumption that the physical traces of Diana's legacy could be edited at will, even in the most carefully chosen moment of reduced scrutiny, without consequence. The Duke of Kent had not acted out of sentimentality or personal affection for a woman he had known only at the formal distance required by his generation and rank. He had acted out of a lifetime's understanding of what the institution owed to its own continuity and to the commemorative decisions already made by those with the standing to make them. At 91, he still possessed the authority, the memory, the contacts, and the will to enforce that understanding. In doing so, he taught a lesson that required no raised voice, no leaked memorandum to the press, and no public spectacle. There were still senior members of the family for whom the hierarchy of legacy remained clear, and for whom the Queen Consort's place, however elevated by marriage and by coronation, did not include the right to erase what had been deliberately placed in the gardens of Kensington Palace for the public to see. The bronze stands there still. Rain falls on it. Visitors leave flowers at its base. Children ask who the woman was and receive answers of varying completeness. The inscription remains legible, and somewhere in the long institutional memory of the household, the episode is retained as a quiet demonstration that certain acts of overreach, even when attempted under the cover of routine maintenance and the temporary absence of the most directly interested parties, can still be met with a response equal to their seriousness. In the months that followed the restoration, small adjustments continued to ripple outward from the original decision. Access protocols for any works in the sunken garden were tightened. The list of individuals authorized to approve changes to commemorative plantings or objects was shortened and made subject to clearer senior oversight. Informal suggestions that certain outdated memorials might benefit from a modern review met with a new and consistent resistance. Camilla, sensing the shift, ceased to test those particular boundaries. She directed her energies elsewhere, toward the public duties and charitable interests that remained safely within her established domain. The defeat was not spoken of in her presence. It did not need to be. Its effects were visible in the continued presence of the bronze and in the quiet alteration of the channels through which decisions about such objects now flowed. William, in private conversation with Catherine, some weeks after the garden reopened, was reported to have said little more than that the right outcome had been reached by the right person. The remark carried an acknowledgement of both relief and the continuing complexity of managing a legacy that refused to become purely historical. Catherine's own response remained characteristically contained. She ensured that the children continued to encounter the statue as a normal feature of the places they sometimes visited, neither emphasized nor avoided. In that ordinary continuity lay its own form of protection. The public, unaware of the brief and nearly successful attempt at erasure, continued to treat the sunken garden as they always had. Tourists photographed the bronze. Locals left small bunches of flowers. On the anniversaries that still mattered to those who remembered Diana as more than a chapter in a larger royal story, the plinth accumulated tributes that the gardeners removed with careful respect the following morning. The statue required no further defense because the defense had already been mounted, successfully, by a man whose name most visitors would not have recognized and whose intervention they would never be told about. The Duke of Kent, having completed the necessary work, returned to the round of duties that had defined so much of his long public life. He attended the services, the dinners, the commemorations that still required the presence of a senior royal of his generation. He spoke when protocol required speech and remained silent when silence was the more accurate response. Those who had watched him handle the matter of the statue understood that he had drawn on every reserve of authority, memory, and institutional knowledge he still possessed. At 91, he had demonstrated that certain responsibilities do not retire when the individual who carries them grows old. They simply wait for the moment when they are needed. Camilla had tested a boundary that she believed had grown flexible with time and with her own elevation. The Duke of Kent had restored it with the full weight of the older forms of authority still available within the family. The statue, once again complete and in its place, marked the difference between the two actions more clearly than any statement could have done. In an institution that often prefers ambiguity and the slow absorption of conflict, the clarity of the outcome constituted its own lasting record. The years will continue to pass. The bronze will weather. New visitors will discover the garden and ask the same questions. The inscription will remain, and the quiet knowledge that the statue was once removed and then returned, at the insistence of an elderly royal who refused to permit the erasure, will persist in the narrower circles that remember such things. Camilla paid the price required of her, financial in part, formal in the written acknowledgement, and structural in the lasting adjustment to her influence over the material heritage of the family. It was enough to reassert the limit. It was enough to ensure that the next person who considered a similar act would remember the precedent. The Duke of Kent had not sought the confrontation. He had simply met it with the instruments available to him and the determination that those instruments should still matter. In doing so, he preserved more than a single bronze figure in a London garden. He preserved the principle that certain commemorative decisions, once made and offered to the public, could not be undone by unilateral action, even from the highest levels of the contemporary household. That principle, reasserted at cost to the Queen Consort, now forms part of the quiet architecture within which the family's physical legacy continues to be managed. The statue stands. The garden receives its visitors. The lesson, administered without spectacle by a man in his 10th decade, endures in the only form that institutions truly respect, as a precedent that subsequent actions must take into account. Camilla, who had sought to clear a space for a different narrative, found that the space had been reclaimed, not by public outcry, not by the direct intervention of Diana's sons, but by the oldest working royal of his generation, who still remembered what the institution was prepared to defend and who retained the authority to defend it. In the end, the story contains no leaked correspondence to the newspapers, no dramatic confrontation caught on camera, no public apology extracted under pressure. It contains only the slower, colder mechanics of institutional correction, the recovery of broken metal, the work of conservators, the written minute, the quiet redirection of influence, and the bronze figure returned to its plinth under the authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Camilla retained her title and her public role. What she lost was the illusion that the remaining physical traces of Diana's presence existed at her discretion. Once that illusion was broken, the statue's continued presence became its own permanent rebuttal. The Duke of Kent returned to his duties. The garden reopened. The public continued to come, and the bronze, restored, stood once more as both memorial and quiet demonstration that some boundaries inside the family still held, even against the will of a queen consort, and even when the man who enforced them was well into his 10th decade of service.